A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, I was married to a woman. And good God, was she ever a piece of work. She lied like she had cancer and lying was the cure. She spent every dime I made faster than I could make it, and she brought being irrational to the level of an art form. She was an entitled bundle of needs and wants and have-tos with big tits. I was driving heavy haul at the time, pulling oil rig components up into the hills of Colorado and Wyoming. I drug 100,000-pound loads up 15% grades and around endless switchbacks on 6, sometimes 7 axles, with walls of rock on one side and stomach-turning drop-offs on the other. It was bona fide white-knuckle shit. Guaranteed to make you talk to Jesus no matter what you believed on Flatland. After the rig components were all delivered, I'd shoot back to Houston for loads of drill pipe and run them back up the same way. Meanwhile, she was back home loading some pipe of her own, if you know what I mean. Of course, and to no one's surprise but mine, it eventually all fell apart. I found out what she was doing, which was basically breaking all the rules while she was breaking the bank. I was flattened by it. I racked my brain trying to figure out how anyone could shove a knife that far in a man's back, with no more effort than it takes to butter a piece of bread. And being the fool I was, I insisted on asking. Of course, she figured it was all my fault, being that I spent my time away from home having all that fun instead of being there with her, tending to her various needs and wants and have-tos. She reckoned I was a bad husband who made her have sex with other men and spend my money. Poor thing didn't have a choice. Now, at this point, I must admit that I was stumped. I was trying to make some sort of sense of how all this was on me, but I just kept drawing a blank. Not that it mattered, though, because it wasn't long after all the poop hit the fan that the lawyers were called in. That's when I found out that the worst of the lying, stealing, damseling, and dirty dealing was still ahead of me. If you think a woman can be a low-life bitch during a marriage, just try one on during a divorce. I won't even bother with all the details. Suffice it to say, I was lucky to get out of it with my ass still attached to my body. And my ass was about the only thing I came into the marriage with that I still had when it was over. My money and my heart were history. I'll say I'm lucky in one way, though. I got a lawyer who didn't lie to me. I know, but it's true. I actually stumbled on an attorney who looked me square in the eye and gave me the good advice to skip the expensive fight, the costly, futile quest for justice, and give her what she wanted because I was going to lose anyway. After all, this was Texas and I had a penis. That's a bad combination in a family court. $1,000 to the lawyer and everything else to her later, I was a free man. Well, free is a relative word. I was divorced. I no longer had her there making me miserable. I was doing a bang-up job of that on my own. The story of my marriage and divorce kept playing out in my mind like a really crappy song, a song that you hate but can't get out of your head. It followed me around like a malicious rumor. It was there when I tried and failed to go to sleep at night, and it was there the moment my eyes opened in the morning. It was there when I put food in my mouth that I was too distracted to taste, and when I hung out with friends, too miserable to have a good time. It was there when I was back at work on the highway, stuck with my unpleasant memories and the sound of my wheels turning, feeling angry with every passing mile. My life, or what seemed like what was left of it, wasn't much more than a stage play for my rage. There was something else going on all that time, though, something else nagging at me through the heat of my bitterness, like there was a missing piece of life's puzzle, some kernel of wisdom hiding in some dark corner of my mind, waiting there for me, ready to show itself when I was ready. But of course, it was a long time before I was anything like ready. As you know, time can be a great healer, Enough of it can put most anything behind you. And for me, a couple of years of fuming had helped to cool down the pressure cooker that my life had become. And somewhere on the road, it was outside of Denver or Cheyenne, I don't remember which, it hit me. Like suddenly the lights got switched on, whether I wanted them to or not. The bitch I married was the bitch I married. I chose her. I opened the door and invited her right into my life. There wasn't a gun to my head. Nobody was twisting my arm. I picked her, pursued her, and stayed with her a long, long time after I knew better. Sure, there was a honeymoon period where she was all love bombs and blowjobs, where the darker parts of her nature were kept on some measure of a leash. But if I'm going to be honest, and I mean the kind of honest you can only be after 2 years of venting and feeling sorry for yourself, there was 1,000 red flags there that I knew about and chose to ignore. Or rather that I chose not to see, even though they were all planted squarely in front of my face. From the time I met her to the time we said I do, I had never seen her own one single bit of her behavior. She had never been accountable for anything. It was clear she thought that the world revolved around her, or at least that it should. And, of course, I just wrote this off to her being a woman. I considered it par for the course with women, which is true, but I let normalized selfishness in women overshadow the fact that I accepted that norm without question. I willingly took a bad deal, a deal that was bound to burn me, because I figured everyone else did. I resigned without lifting a finger to stop it. Whether or not these dangerous features of personality were typical for women, I still made the choice to ignore them, to look past them, because her acceptance of me, however transient, was all I was interested in. It was all that mattered, which was another way of saying that I didn't matter, and I acted like it. I'll tell you one thing. It's a humbling experience after 2 years of moving a mile a minute, beating the steering wheel, and cussing like a sailor, to wake up to the fact that the only thing that had happened, the only thing that mattered, was that I had gotten what I paid for. I entered a relationship like a simp, and I got treated like one. End of story. I didn't know it at the time, but that moment, that epiphany on the interstate, was my first red pill. A few years later, Warren Farrell would come along with a book that helped me put it all into more complete context, but that small slice of my life was my first major step toward a life immunized from ever taking that kind of deal again. I still think of that moment from time to time, especially when I hear from men who are convinced that they're victims, that they aren't allowed to hold a woman to account, that they can't take care of themselves, especially with men who swear up and down that they had no way of knowing what they were in for. And I get it. I would have sworn to the very same thing if you had asked me before that day. And true to life, some men do get taken totally by surprise. Some men do, I suppose, step on a landmine without ever having had a way of knowing they were in a minefield. I just can't say that I ever met one. Men's most redeeming feature, in my opinion, is the ability to own their shit. It's the capacity for accountability that we so feverishly socialize out of a woman's way of thinking. It's our one advantage with women, and it would be an advantage over them if our gynocentrism weren't such an Achilles heel. As a matter of fact, under the influence of our gynocentrism, our accountability goes toxic. We end up taking on a lot of crap that doesn't belong to us. We can be convinced that we're to blame for being abused because we didn't do this or that enough, or we didn't do it right, or at the right time in the right way, because we said the wrong thing, or because we didn't say the right thing, because we didn't make someone happy who is constitutionally incapable of happiness. We can blame ourselves for the mistakes and misdeeds of others, and of course by others I mean women. We don't practice this ridiculous self-inflicted overburdening with other men. With women, we can even practice a level of hyperagency that leads us to sacrifice our bodies to work in order to provide, and at the same time take blame and accept betrayal for being absent. There is no shortage of women whining endlessly about husbands who are married to their work, but who would be gone with the wind in a heartbeat if he slowed down. Remember, my ex's heartfelt and sincere excuse for an affair was that I was too busy taking care of her. Men are vulnerable to this garbage because our sense of accountability reacts to gynocentrism by becoming a tumor. In that cancerous condition, we refuse to hold women accountable and refuse to hold ourselves to account for pretending that a turd is a rose. And of course, the resistance to that is understandable. If we all held women to account, most of us wouldn't be able to stand more than 10 minutes with most of them. A lot of marriages and long-term relationships simply wouldn't happen. Subsequently, a lot of divorces wouldn't happen either. A lot of misery, a lot of heartache, a lot of affairs, and a lot of loss would be prevented. And in case you're wondering, that is the point of this talk. Indeed, it's the point of all my talks. That as men, our ability to hold our own feet to the fire is the best friend we'll ever have. And our failure to do that where it concerns women is our worst enemy. Worse than the state, worse than the family courts, worse than feminism, worse even than gynocentrism itself. Our only alternative to being accountable is the way of the victim so commonly embraced by women, children, and feminists. With that, I end this talk, urging you as always to remember that there are no victims, just volunteers. Don't be that volunteer. As always, folks, I hope you've enjoyed, even if you haven't, and we'll see you next time.